Hey folks, welcome to the Past Priority Podcast, a podcast where we talk about competitive Commander from a different perspective. I'm your host, Greg, and today I'm joined by my wonderful co-hosts, Evan and Zach.
Evan, you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. I'm Evan, ZClan7 on Discord. I manage the Animar Discord and keep up to date on the current CDH Animar deck list.
And my name is Zach. I go by Disco Breaker in most servers. I am mostly responsible for tempering Greg's Twitter posts and keeping him in check there. You can also find me playing incredibly awful mid-range and Stax decks.
I have seen you play incredibly awful decks.
Are you telling me that Timna Tavesh is not the CEDH All-Star that it needs to
No,
be?
just play Blue Farm. It's not Grixis.
At least you're off Timnatana Hermit Druid. That was a wild ride. But
we had some weird phases in there.
yeah. So let's start off this episode today. We're going to be talking about the key differences between Stax and Control, and basically, like, are they the same thing? Are they totally different? Can you call a Control deck a Stax deck? Is it wrong to call a Control deck a Stax deck? The answer is yes, by the way. But we're going to start off from this Reddit post that we found that was posted a year ago on r/EDH. And it's this question that says, are Stax and Control the same or the similar thing? And what do you guys think about it?
I think it's fantastic that it's on the r/EDH subreddit. This a particular user has the tag extreme budget player, so we already know where he's coming from. But he talks about he doesn't know if they should be the same thing, and the top response is this guy saying that they're basically the same thing. So I know you feel very strongly about that, Greg. But Zach, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to probably agree with what I assume Greg's take here is, and that they are not the same thing. They do both try and control the game in some sense, but a lot of the similarities stop there.
Yeah, that's kind of where my opinion on it is.
Yeah, I'm kind of under the umbrella that Control and Stax are both actually just control decks, but we'll just let it unfold from there.
Yeah, I think you're just wrong in that sense.
All right, well, let's fight about it.
All right, so like, how do you think a Stax deck should attempt to control a threat, right? Like, if a Stax deck sits down and it's up against, a Grixis pile, a Rog say, like, how does that Stax deck attempt to interact with that?
Well, the Stax deck really has to start in deck construction at that point. You have to know sort of what field that you are trying to attack here. And I think Control falls into a similar boat of I need to play certain answers in my deck to fight what I'm expecting to play against. But the answers that you are looking for are extremely different, and they need to come down at very different times of the game. So if I'm playing a Stax deck, I am aggressively mulliganing into my turn one interaction so that I am not just completely blown out of this game. I can't rely on like a Force of Will or a Flusterstorm to bail me out later. I just need to hit the table as soon as possible.
Yeah, so I guess you're saying you're aggressively mulliganing for interaction, but it's not interaction in the traditional sense. It's interaction like, here's a Collector Oof, here's a Draenith Magistrate, here is a Rule of Law, even though they're kind of weird right now. You're not looking for the stereotypical interaction piece. You're looking for something that has to hit the board immediately and prevent a win from happening on that next turn.
Yeah, I'm looking to fundamentally change the way the game is going to play out and develop in the first couple turns. So something like a Deafening Silence or a Collector Oof fundamentally changes what a Grixis deck that is focused around artifact mana can do. You can't just go into City of Traders, play out an Arcane Signet, tap Arcane Signet, play out a Soul Ring, and go off from there. Both Collector Oof and Deafening Silence on turn one really shut down that plan.
Well,
Exactly.
Here's my question for you. So if you're mulliganing for your turn one interaction, let's just say it's first control, and you play that Deafening Silence, what are you actually doing then? The way I see it is you're actually just making it so cards in your opponent's hands don't work well together, and they actually are basically not valid at that point. So things like their Dark Rituals don't work because they can't Dark Ritual and cast another spell. But how is that would you say that's better or different than the way control would mulligan? Because the control is going to be looking for like the 2 counter spells, but is the counter spell going to want to hit as
I
many
would
spells as the stack
say the
species?
easiest thing to think about here is control is looking to snipe the payoff, while a Stax deck is looking to stop the development and not even get to the point where that payoff comes up.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty much exactly it. Like a Stax deck may need to hit 2 or 3 pieces of stacks engines or stack interactions um, to prevent a win attempt from happening. But all I need to do is hit like a swan song or a miscast. I just need to have a couple different counter spells, and those couple different counter spells, if I can prevent the Nas from resolving, I don't care if the wrong side player has cast 15 different mana rocks and they have a bajillion stuff in play. If they don't have a payoff or any way to get to that payoff, like the mana isn't doing anything for them. And that's where the mindset of control really changes from the mindset of stacks, because you're trying to prevent that whole explosiveness from happening. And that's just not where I want to be when interacting with things.
Yeah, Stacks, I am trying to change the way that this game is developed. I'm trying to protect my own investments, and I'm trying to then get to a point where I can end this game quickly. Because as we're going to talk about later, I'm sure, um, trying to just play out a heavily stacked out board and eventually finding your win condition is not the best thing to be doing anymore. The answers in Magic have gotten a whole lot better, and it is pretty easy to pick apart certain stacks pieces that are locking out opponents. And one of the downsides of playing stacks is because you are stifling that development, a lot of times your opponents that are being held back by your stacks pieces are just sitting there accumulating resources and just waiting to go off.
Mm-hmm. I definitely have played my fair share of games where everyone's sitting underneath a rule of law or two, and it seems like the perfect lock, and then someone casts a spell, and then it's like, oh, here's an overloaded cyclonic rift on the stack. But it's not even rift. It could just be like a channeled Boseiju targeting the one thing that's preventing my Oracle consult from winning the
Yeah,
game.
I've also seen
And
games where someone, like, two people cast their spells, and then someone goes end step Tainted Pact, untap, and then just Thassa's Oracle under a rule of law, and they perfectly win the game that way.
yep, I've definitely done that before. But it's like there are ways to play around stacks, and so stacks is one of those things where it's like the lock has to get tighter the longer the game goes. You can't just expect two pieces of stacks to just completely lock out the game. You need to keep on presenting threats turn after turn after turn, and it really bogs people down. And it's like, great, I can't draw extra cards. I can only cast one spell per turn. I can't search my deck. I can't activate this artifact. I can't activate this Thrasios. I'm completely locked out, and there's no one card that does that. It's usually an amalgamation of a couple cards.
Yep, I agree.
So what would you say about so when I'm playing proactive stacks, right? How would you say proactive stacks today would then differ from stacks decks a few years ago? Um, I haven't been playing Magic that long to know, so I'm genuinely curious about how stacks decks are different now to combat these really fast Grixis piles versus what they were doing before that's no longer valid.
Sure. I would first let's start by going over I would say like the three main types of stacks pieces that you will find in a stacks deck or a deck that is focused around stacks. The three main strategies of a stacks deck are removal of resources, taxing of resources, and tapping of resources. So when you're thinking of removing of resources, I'm thinking of effects like Null Rod and Collector Oof that remove my ability or remove my opponent's artifact mana resources. You have Aven Mind Sensor and Opposition Agent would prevent my opponents from tutoring. Dranith Magistrate cuts out a lot of the value engines that you find in the command zone. Graph Digger's Gauge and Dothy Voidwalker take the graveyard away as a resource. And more popular I've seen come up now is Torpor Orb effects or Tocatli Honor Guard, I think the card is. Stopping Thassa's Oracle, stopping Dockside, two huge effects that just immediately get shut down. Uh,
Yeah, I'd
so
actually like
those
to
are,
talk about
yeah.
those ETB preventers here for a second because I don't see them run a lot, but when I do see them, I get hard stopped by them. So, what do you think of them as effects in and of itself? Like, what decks can look to efficiently run effects like this?
You mostly find that sort of effect in white as a color. And most, I think all of the effects are symmetrical. So it's going to be tough to play effects like Thassa's Oracle at Dockside yourself if you would like to really focus and push those effects. I think there's at least 2 or 3 different cards that can handle that. Torpor Orb, Hushwing Griff, and Takali Honor Guard are the 3 that come to mind.
See, this is where I think Stax really shines, is that it can use this artifact or creature to effectively stop the card in my hand. Whereas if you had the Mindbreak Trap or Forcible for my dock side, I can now battle you on the stack instead of just being completely invalidated of the card in my hand, which is really important. It looks like for this removal of resources that you're talking about here.
Um, but it is still tough. Like these effects, while powerful, a lot of modern card design is focused around this immediate value, which usually comes in the form of an enters the battlefield effect. And it's really hard to build a deck around solid cards that don't take advantage of that. Like even win conditions in something like Metapod or other decks use things like Felidar Guardian and Karmic Guide loops. I know Dante has been really huge on his Abzan Kodama list. Kodama doesn't do anything with Torpor Orb in play. So like
Right.
it's while they're great stacks effects, your deck really it can really struggle to find room for them. A lot of these win cons, you're kind of forced to remove your own stacks pieces and take down your own shields to go for your own wins.
Yeah.
And like another example of that is like Nullrod and Collector Oof. You see them frequently alongside decks that play Birthing Pod and are like very in Birthing Pod lines. Like I have definitely played triple Nullrod effects in Metapod with Birthing Pod being as my main win con. It was the namesake of the deck. And those kind of nombos, they do hurt your ability to convert like stacks out controlled board states into win cons effectively. Sometimes can delay you a turn or two, or even throw the game in some instances. But it's kind of the nature of trying to attack the format at its most vital point.
Mm-hmm. So
Right.
I see a lot of Stax games like randomly come down to combat damage. And is that something that you're actively thinking about when brewing? Because you said like if you have triple null rod effects, right, and your main win con is a birthing pod. In those games, do you ever sit there and stare at your locked out board and it's like maybe I just need to reevaluate deck construction and find a way to win without combos. And so something like Winota is a perfect example of a deck that frequently wins by combat and rarely ends games in a combo. Does Birthing Pod like do that?
I would say I would go even as far to
Other than
say
pod effects.
Winota's not a stacks deck. It's like a tempo aggressive deck. Like it is just trying to kick your teeth in, and it
Yeah.
is using these stacks pieces to outvalue and out tempo your opponents to give you that window to punch through that last bit of damage. Rebel also really pushed this idea with her deck Wildpile, where
Mm.
she just straight up removed every combo from the deck and just put in things like Rurikthar, Kamal, Elishnorn, and just really kicked in damage. Charles, the mono white guy, I see his mono white decks frequently just beating face with Elishnorn and what is the Sarah's Ascendant.
Saracen,
Like
yeah, it's a
that
big
hits
one.
hard. You put people out of Adnaw's range very quickly, and a lot of their deck just shuts off from that point.
Yeah.
So I'd like to bring this conversation back around to why, Greg, you think that this is different than Control. Um, the game plan of stacks just stopping their opponents from doing anything. How is that different than a Control list?
So in my eyes at least, stacks you have to do everything before the threat comes down. Like you can't respond to an underworld breach attempt on your next turn with your rest in peace or your Dothy Voidwalker, right? Once the underworld breach resolves, there's like a 99% chance the game's already over. And so if you made the decision to not play your stacks piece that could prevent this kind of win and you just decide to pass the turn and then that effect comes down, there's nothing you can do about it. And the one thing I like about Control, specifically with Thrasios decks, is that it plays very differently. I can sit there and be like, I have 7 mana, 8 mana, untap, land, pass the turn. And now I'm threatening a bunch of different things. I have at its floor 2 Thrasios activations, which is 2 cards or 2 lands. And then I could also be showing basically any number of counter magic. And it's that aspect of timing that I think is the key difference between what Control and Stax tries to do.
Yeah,
Stax,
there's
yeah,
two
go ahead.
major points I'd like to pull up there. That ability to feign and bluff interaction versus just putting all of your cards on the table and saying, "This is what I have, beat it if you
Mhm.
can," is extremely different. And the main way that I think that plays out is that stack decks often get targeted by especially like newer and more inexperienced players, thinking my deck cannot win under these circumstances. I need to remove these stacks pieces and I need to target this player because they are in the lead. Meanwhile, a control deck, I feel you often sit back, let
Mhm.
that stacks player or let that ad nos player take the blunt of that damage and be that number one threat, and then you try and swoop in afterwards. I think those are
That's
two very different play patterns.
it's exactly how I'm trying to play the game. Like I'm just trying to play it in a very reactive sense where I'm not spending any card from my hand unless someone else is actively attempting to win. Like I guess it depends with what kind of interaction pieces I have, but most of the time I won't counter anything until it's the Nas on the stack or it's like the consult for the Thassa's Oracle on the stack because I really don't care about any other spell cast throughout the game. Usually, if I've got Remoras or if I have a Remora or a Rhystic Study out, and you're storming through your deck to eventually hit a win con, I only have to answer the massive payoff, and usually just reap the benefits of all of those spells you cast beforehand. And in a Stax deck, it's like you have to prevent that whole thing from happening. You have to play your cards first. There's no sitting there and feigning what you have in hand. If you wanted to make the comparison that Stax is effectively played like Control and vice versa, Control would just sit there with its hand face up, all of its answers shown. And at that point, you're not playing a Control deck, you're just playing terrible Magic. I think the strongest part about Control is that you really just get to lie about what you have in hand. And if you're just sitting there with a full grip, people can only assume what you have. And if they think it's six pieces of interaction, they'll never go for the win attempt. And I could be staring at a bunch of lands and like Nature's Claim, and it's like this doesn't do anything here. But
Well, here's where I think that I think we differ in opinion because the way I see it is control and stacks, or at least control as you define it, falls into the same category of just general control. Each one's just trying to do it in a slightly different way. And there is something to be said about countering just the resource enablers and like the things that are just winning the game versus just having one card that's is stopping four cards across the table
but
from even doing anything.
but that comparison of like both stacks decks and control decks are trying to control the game or lock down the game, right? But they're doing it from a different angle. In that sense, like I could make a very easy comparison from like a Rog Silas Turbo Nas compared to a Rog Thrasios Turbo Polymorph, right? Because they're both super proactive decks trying to win the game super early, or at least be in a point where they can turn to win super early or whenever they want. And but the decks don't play out the same. I mean, a poly Kraken build is going to play very differently from an ad nauseum build. It's just they're not the same decks. Like they're both trying to win early. They're both trying to be proactive. Yes, Control and Stacks are both attempting to slow down the game. They're both attempting to play the long game, but it's not executed the same way. And if we're just generalizing how decks are executed, then there's just proactive and reactive, and that's it. And there's nothing else.
I think that's a fair point.
Yeah, very well said.
Yeah.
It's almost like you've had to explain this before.
A lot of times. I had this discussion the other day on the Playing a Power server. I think there were a couple people that were memeing, and then some people had some hot takes, and then more memers came in. But I had to exit the discussion. But a lot of people were saying that stacks and control were the same thing, and it was like, no, oh my god, they're not. They're just not played the same way. But
Yeah,
you know,
every deck that runs counter spells is a control deck, actually.
I have
that's
heard
a
this one.
scalding hot take. My deck runs Force of Negation, thus it takes on the control role. Yeah.
Yeah, I run Red Elemental Blast. I'm Magda control now.
Yeah, your Magda control. It's I don't know exactly what the threshold is for how many counter spells or how many pieces of interaction you have to run. I'm a crazy person, so I think I'm up to 35. But
Yeah, you're definitely a crazy person.
yeah, it's just the way I
I
like to
think
play.
I actually have a very similar thought of like how many stacks pieces do you have to run to be considered a stacks deck, or what types of stacks pieces do you have to run?
because every deck that has white in it is going to be running Drannith Magistrate, right?
Oh
At
yeah,
least
definitely.
responsibly. Is
Yeah,
Blue
I've
Farm
seen
with
that
one
more
Drannith a
in.
Stax deck?
I'm actually in the middle of writing this Blue Farm primer with Connor actually, and because the only one out there is a meme, so we're like, "Oh, we're just gonna fuck it, we're just gonna make a real Blue Farm primer." So we're writing this
Mhm.
primer, and we get to like individual cards and like why we're Blue Farm is or isn't running it. It's like you should see Connor's like paragraph explanation for Drain of the Magistrate. And I'm like, I think Drain of the Magistrate should be in the deck, but also Blue Farm is not a control deck. It's not a Stax deck. It's not really anything. It's just kind of everything, which is probably the perfect example here of saying that just because Force of Will is in your deck, you're not a control deck. Just because Draenith is in the deck, you're not a Stax deck, and so on. Um,
Blue Farm is unique because it's just a pile of like it's like
The best
98
cards,
best
and
cards.
Drannith is
Yeah,
one of the best cards.
it's one of the best cards.
it is one of the best cards.
That's how that deck
There's
is
like
played.
4 or 5 white cards that are like auto include in every deck that can play them. So any white deck, and then it kind of just falls off a cliff there in terms of playability for white cards.
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for Charles for taking up
I
the
don't know
mono
how he
white
does it.
banner. Yeah, could not be
Yeah, I
me.
haven't gotten to play against him yet, but I've heard crazy things. So
He's also just an extremely talented player. That also helps. I feel
Very
like you can
smart.
give
fair
him a
enough.
deck of 99 islands and he would still find a way to win.
True.
Dang. So since the you're making the argument that they're two different things, Greg, would you like to tell? Can we start talking about the pros and cons of each strategy then versus each other?
Oh
Because I feel
yeah.
like there's definitely something to be said.
So in low skill pods, if you have a Stax deck and a control deck at the table, I don't think the Stax deck is ever winning those games. Mainly because it's really if you're taking on the control role and you're serious about playing the control deck at the table, you have to be at least a little bit talented at manipulating people and encouraging people to attack the wrong
Talented at
target
manip-
and encouraging people to make the wrong decisions to benefit you are it's really easy. Um, Control is seriously just happy sitting there just getting land pass, land pass, land pass for 10 turns, and it doesn't play anything threatening that whole time. You're just sitting there building up resources and drawing cards and slowly assembling your engines. And the second the stack stack is gone, which all the other decks want the stack stack gone, I'm in a position where it's like, great, I no longer have to worry about a player and I have everything I need because people have let me sit here all this time without disrupting me. Um,
So what you're telling me is that if I sit there and let you get value and you manipulated me into doing what you wanted me to do, it's just a skill issue at that point?
it's a skill issue.
It's a skill
No,
issue.
but
All right, gotcha.
it is a thing because control doesn't play with their cards face up, right? It's all hidden information. So unless you Gataxian probe me or there's a telepathy in play, there's no way you're gonna know what I have in hand. And stack decks have to show their answers. They have to play their cards in order to impact the board, right?
I'm going to start running
All right.
telepathy in all my decks to
I was
show
gonna say
that
I
Greg is
just put
actually
it
the
in my
threat of the
Mox field
table.
list.
I'm gonna
Yeah, I
cry.
just put it in my Mox field list. Sorry, Greg.
I'll retire.
Yeah, that is a major point there. Playing with hidden information, especially at lower skilled or less experienced tables, I would say.
Mhm.
Um, in gaming in general, it's like the level 0, the level 1 thought process is getting to the point where you're thinking like, what is my cohesive game plan as a player in this game? That next level of thinking of my opponents aren't just 3 goldfish sitting there. They also have a game plan that they're trying to enact. What
Mhm.
is their game plan and how do I interact with that? When it's a bunch of stacks pieces that are face up on the table, it's very easy to sit there and think, well, my game plan is this. I currently can't do it because of this player. I need to take out that player. When that information is hidden in someone's hand, it's very easy to gloss over that as a newer or less experienced player.
Mhm.
So what I'd like to say here is, if I'm sitting there with my Force of Will in my hands as the control deck, and someone tries to go for a win, and I have to use my interaction to do that, I just 1-for-1 myself. Actually, 2-for-1 because it's Force of Will in this case. 2-for-1 myself on this one win attempt. How is that? How would you say that would be better than just me playing the rule of law that would just blanket stop like 2 or 3 things from even happening at all, and I didn't have to 1-for-1. Instead, I like 1-for-3 or 1 for so many myself.
because that's the only trade that I have to make at that current stack. If everyone's going to be priority bullying me, and it's like, Greg, you're the control deck, you've been playing this deck for a long time, I know you have the answer for this Nas, I can show them the Force of Will, and then it's like, that's it, that's what I got, here's a Force of Will. I'll even pitch like a Thassa's Oracle sometimes because I know I have other win cons in my deck, so I'll just pitch that and be like, all right, here's my answer. This was a Desperation Force, and I can sit here and still have a Fierce and a SWAT, or like, so I could have 2 or 3 more pieces of interaction in my hand. Um, but if it gets down to the point where I'm being forced to be priority bullied, I'll show my worst counter spell and leave it at that and be like, it's on you guys for the rest of it. And if it really comes down to the point where we're losing, I'll interact and save the game. But
The other thing
it's
is once that spell is countered, that Adnaz is put in the
mhm,
grave, that demonic consultation gets
it's
countered.
gone. It's gone.
It's gone. Yeah, that player doesn't have that resource anymore. You don't have to be as concerned with it. Obviously, there's like recursion
Mhm.
effects and whatnot, but the immediate threat there is gone. All
Yeah.
Stax is really doing is just building players' available resources that they have in their hand, and if those Stax pieces are gone, it's just opening the floodgates. It's all hell's gonna let loose at that point.
You just sit there
Oh
on
You're
a
yeah.
like
ticking
a
time bomb
cyclonic
until
rift, a toxic
yeah.
deluge away from just getting blown out.
Yeah, no,
I
because
think
the
that's a
longer
really
the
good
game
point.
goes on, all Stacks is doing is it's preventing people from playing their hands, right? And so people will still sit there and they'll stockpile the gas that they need to just turn whatever they have into a win. And again, control targets the one payoff spell. And if I have more interaction in my deck than most of the times 2 decks combined at the table, and so I can beat what they have in hand most of the time when I'm trying to stop that singular payoff. And so it just attacks different aspects of the format, right? I'm trying to hit the Nas. Stax is just trying to hit everything that they're doing until they can assemble a combo.
Yours
I
counter
think
magic
it's
also
completely fair.
provides some level of protection for you in your win attempts. Meanwhile, my stacks attempts or like my stacks pieces usually do something to hinder my win attempts, and I even have to go as
Mhm.
far back to deck building and really change how I'm trying to win the game. I have to play things like Kiki Jiki to win the game, or
Yeah.
whatever weird Hellkite Tyrant Magda is playing now. Those
Yes.
are not optimal win cons, but with the way that Stacks has to play out, they are the best ones I have available.
No, exactly.
Yeah, I think the best stacks in the format is actually unplayable because it just gets overshadowed by better stacks. Personally, I think that the collector oof stacks effects and the null rods and the stony silence, like that is the top tier, along with rule of law. Like those are the top tier stacks pieces, but no deck can really effectively run these pieces without hindering their own way to win the game significantly.
No, no, like soft stacks deck. Like Blue Farm couldn't slot in like a best cards pile couldn't slot in a single null rod effect just to stop
Oh,
other
for
players.
sure.
Right? If you're gonna run these effects, you have to be dedicated stacks. You got to be running probably 30 stacks pieces. But
Yeah, I have a great example for you actually.
yeah,
So before I came to be an Animar player, the deck was on Collector Oof. It was on a whole bunch of dorks and Collector Oof and like 4 artifact ramp, and it got to the point where I just completely revamped the entire mana system. I took out all the mono green dorks. I put in talismans. I put in a talisman enablers, ancient tomb, took out the collector roof, and this was like a huge thing for this deck that's been on the stacks piece for so long. But after playing the deck on a revamped, faster mana base, there's no way I can go back. It's just the deck is faster now and doesn't really benefit from having the collector roof as much as it does from just having fast mana. And that's really the issue with the best card piles that we're seeing in the format right now. Like all the Grixis piles, they just can't afford it because there's so much better things to be doing.
Yeah, as the
mhm.
Null Rod or Collector Oof player in the room, I am definitely pretty sad when I watch everyone get to play out all of their 2 mana rocks on turn one, and then I sit there and go Llanowar Elves pass. That definitely is not a
For
great
sure.
feeling.
Dork Pass is not a great play anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree. Let's see. So, what do you guys think about like non hard stacks pieces, like soft stacks pieces? Damping Sphere is one that comes to mind, where it you can still combo under a Damping Sphere. There are a lot of decks that can still win under it, right? You can just Oracle Consult and it's still 4 mana under a Damping Sphere.
So
I used to play
I,
this effect in Curious Control for a while because I was on Baron Dockside, and it prevented the Nas decks from winning on turn two. And then when I wanted to go for the win, I could just sacrifice it to Baron and present my loop there. But what do you guys think about like the soft stacks effects?
yeah, this definitely goes into that second category of stacks I was talking about, the second strategy of taxing resources. So things like Thalia, Thorn of Amethyst, my personal favorite, Trinisphere, uh, another types of effects like Rule of Law, things that are restricting what your opponents can do with their turn effectively and making their decks basically lose tempo. In a format that is condensed to 3 to 5 turns, if you can push your opponent's effective value, like effective turn, out a turn or two and buy that window, it's huge.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, for sure. I think any so I play Sithis, which is basically just soft stacks deck, right? So it can't run any of the hard stacks because it will just effectively stop Sithis from doing anything. But being able to tempo your opponents in any way, shape, or form for cheap is just backbreaking most of the time. You set them back 2 turns just because you played your Rest in Peace into their Breach deck on turn 1 or 2 for 2 mana, and they have to figure out a way to remove it and then proceed from there. So I think soft stacks really has this benefit of allowing your deck to do what it wants to do to further its own game plan, while not setting itself too far behind, but also tempoing the other decks, because all you want to do is tempo the other decks, not necessarily lock them out in this case.
Yeah, you're basically trying to slow them down to your speed. When you have some of the most efficient cards ever printed in Magic, just adding 1 mana to them completely changes how effective they are. Turning Dark Ritual into Desperate Ritual is a gigantic setback for that type of deck.
For sure. So when you're talking about stacks, just like as a deck type, how would you say you would build a what's the most efficient stacks deck right now, and how would you go about really looking at it? I would say Winota, right? And I want to just kind of dissect why Winota is the type of stacks deck that's at the top tier right now, and how that like looks for the rest of the format, or compared to the
I
rest of the
think
format.
if you are setting out with this plan of I'm going to play a bunch of really hard stacks pieces, I'm going to lock down the board, and I'm eventually going to draw into my win comp or like my win condition, my like super expensive 8 mana combo using Timna to draw cards with these mana darks, you're not really setting yourself up for success here. I think answers in Magic have gotten hyper efficient with new play design. Things like Dress Down can really unlock a board.
Oh.
The Seiju Who Endures, man, that card really blows up stacks pieces like no other.
Oh
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Um, those those have made me incredibly sad as a stacks player to see printed. Cyclonic Rift is also just backbreaking usually. So I want to be on one of two strategies, I think. I want to have like a more mid-ranged value focused plan where I can play some stacks pieces to slow down the fast decks, but still keep up in value and threaten to win quickly. So something like a Magda that can win seemingly out of nowhere, but it also has a ton of value pieces to grind out games. Or you can be on something like Winota, which is just kicking your teeth in as fast as possible, and it might throw down some stacks pieces along the way. I think Winota, looking at it, runs like 11 stacks pieces, and they're not even like turn one, turn two stacks pieces. It's really focused on I'm going to put this Winota in play, and I'm going to flip in what is the 7 mana that doubles damage, or
Angrass
Blade
Marauders.
Historian and gave double
Yeah.
strike. Like those are not stacks pieces. They're ending the game. They're
Yeah.
not. Yeah,
I
Yeah.
mean,
So
the other
you
thing
really want
about
to be
Winota is
proactive.
that Winota is a very proactive combo deck or proactive like aggro deck, and I think one of the reasons why Winota is considered like such a top tier stacks deck right now is because in tournament play we have 75-minute round timers, and that's not long enough to let stacks decks truly thrive. Like a lot of traditional stacks, like one or two color stacks decks, they're gonna go to time basically every game, and Winota is just one of those decks where it's like it's snowball stacks. I think is the Ian's original name for it. But it just gets out of control way too fast, and it throws out all of these threats and all of these threats. And even though Winota could be played more aggressively with combat in mind, or could be played with combo in mind, it's going to end games a lot quicker than a Heliod stacks list. That's just playing 85 stacks pieces in some lands. So
So that's really interesting because you were talking about tempoing your opponents to really get yourself into the game plan with your opponents, like at the same speed. But I think what the best stack decks like Winota are doing is they're just able to tempo their opponents for a couple turns, but also win the game before their tempo is finished. Like they're caught back up to where they were
mhm.
before the stack speed came down, which is
Yeah,
what I
tempo
think
is
makes it
usually
so
going to
strong.
come at the expense of cards and value. And at some point, you run out of value, and the decks that have been slowed down will start to take back over. It's a careful
Right.
balancing act there.
Yeah. Well, the thing about Winota is you just get to cheat a bunch of mana costs. I mean, if you like put Winota into play on turn 1, right, and you can trigger, or no, you put like stuff into play on turn 1, then you Winota into play on turn 2, and you trigger Winota on turn 2. So you get 2 Winota triggers. If you put a 3-drop and a 4-drop into play on turn 2, you just cheated 7 mana out. That's really insane compared to what basically any other deck in the format's doing. I mean, if a Nas deck was cheating out effectively 7 mana on turn 2, the game would be over. So if you think about it in that comparison, Winota is pretty damn good.
So how
I
does
think Magda falls into a similar boat there, where you're able to convert all of these stupid little shitters, like dwarven whatever,
yeah, that's what
Blood
they
Fire
are. They're
Dwarf.
into
shitters.
massive amounts of mana, and then you're able to even just take that mana and convert it even more into something like Utrava Hellkite, I think it is, the 6/6 that makes more 6/6s. That will end a game real fast as well.
Yeah, that one does.
So
Um,
if control decks, so if you're looking at a stack deck and it has to tempo its opponents in some way, shape, or form in order to get its value,
mhm.
how would a control deck then differ from this by not just tempoing their opponents and then get the value? Like how is that different?
So a control deck is going to play a lot more similarly to Winota than it is going to play to a traditional stacks list because it wants to do what every other CDH deck is doing, which is to get a lot of mana and play a lot of cards real fast. Um, but it wants to establish those advantage engines and then just sit back and ride those advantage engines out to win the game. If that makes sense at all. But
Oh no, for
yeah,
sure. Because
yeah.
stack decks are, I mean, in my own opinion, looking to the pretty much the exact same thing in the sense that they need to slow their opponents down with one card, whether that's a stacks piece or in a controls deck, force will type thing, just to slow their opponents down for the 2 turns until they can establish some sort of board state and value.
yeah. I think the Grixis deck just wants to develop its mana and put it into a payoff, and maybe a Ristic or a Mystic or some other value piece. Meanwhile, I think Greg's control lists are trying to do the opposite of where they're developing their mana to play out that value piece to then later go for that win. So
Mhm.
similar start to the plan, but just taking a slight deviation there, while the Stax deck is just kind of off doing its own thing, playing ridiculous things like Null Rod and
Yeah.
Trinisphere
No.
on turn 1.
100%. I will say though, if a Trinisphere ever comes out turn 1 before I get to play as control, it's basically game over. I don't think there's a lot of ways to beat a turn 1 Trinisphere unless
No,
I
they
have
def
exactly
they
Boseiju
yeah
in
no
hand.
they went
But
Lotus Petal, Rite of Flame, Trinisphere, and you had the Mindbreak Trap. All right,
yeah,
every time.
That
I
hurt.
wish. I wish.
Or you kind of just flash
Uh,
your Mindbreak Traps so they don't do it in the first place.
no, it reminds me of a game I played week and a half ago, where I had Land Crypt Signet Mystic Remora, and if I had just played Land Remora and then did Crypt Signet, I wouldn't have gotten blown out by the Mindbreak Trap. But I was like, oh, this is too cute to just chain all my spells up. And then as I had the Mystic Remora on the stack, I looked at my friend in the eyes and I was like, just Mindbreak Trap me. I know you have it. And he just threw it on the table. I was like, oh, damn it.
Yeah,
But
that's normally how it goes. I have Spite trapped before.
yeah, playing around Mindbreak Trap is something that all decks need to learn how to do, especially me.
I've
So
definitely got my hand caught in the cookie jar playing out a Lotus Petal before my Trinisphere and getting my Trinisphere snagged by a Mindbreak Trap. That game would have been easily mine if I just did
well,
not
here's
want
the
to
thing.
get
You,
that
you
Lotus
can't
Petal in
even
play.
you can't even like that. The correct play is to play your Lotus Petal if you're not paying 3 mana later for
Oh
the
yeah,
Lotus
it
Petal. So you
definitely.
can't even blame yourself for
No,
that.
it's 100% correct.
Okay, I need to take a detour real quick with you, Greg.
Yeah.
Tell me about Days, please, because I keep seeing it pop up and I don't know how to feel about it.
So recently I was tweeting about Days, but I was getting my ass kicked by it for a long time. Um, Days is one of those weird counter spells that I think realistically only the super aggressive decks have been playing. It's a 2 mana counter target spell unless they pay 1, but it has this line of text that says you can return an island to your hand to pay the mana cost of Days. Um, and I think it's the most interesting counterspell, um, because it allows you to protect a lot of your early plays, turns 1 through 3, and it's frequently like the last counterspell on the stack. And I I would just recommend playing Days before you hate on it, because it looks really clunky, and it can feel clunky if you're staring at your opening hand and it's like Command Tower, Exotic Orchard, Forbidden Orchard, and it's like, look at all this perfect mana, no way to cheat this Days out. But you already have perfect mana, and so you're in a much better spot. But basically, every fetch land is going to find a blue X land. So you're never going to have that situation where you can't return an island to cast it for free. And it's one of those counter spells that you have to use really aggressively. And so it's like, I'm countering your Remora with this. I'm countering, or here's, you casted a Stax piece on turn 1 or turn 2. I have no mana presenting. Here's this interaction. And I was also progressing my game plan. So if my turn 1 was like land Birds of Paradise pass, I can now interact or have interaction for your turn 1 play or your turn 2 play and still not be behind on my turn, because I'll just replay my land and still have 2 mana on turn 2. It's
Yeah, this
pretty
is so
flexible.
funny for me because my background is primarily as a legacy player, where that format is no stranger to Days. That thing is an absolute menace to the point where a lot of prominent figures in the format are asking for it to be banned. Like,
I think if something is ban worthy in another format, we should look at it in CDH. Just
that's
just
probably a
saying.
good take.
I think that's a
Yeah.
really hot take because like I've been like hating on Days and everyone who's thought about running it for like the past 2 weeks, and then there's like all these there's couple scenarios that get brought up to me like, hey Evan, look at this Days, it just blew someone the fuck out, and I'm like, well, can you show me all the times that Days wouldn't have done that because they have a mana open afterwards? And then they're real quiet, so I'm still unsure.
So I could
But
actually comment
making
on
them
that.
have that mana is huge.
Yeah, making them have
Like,
the mana is huge.
that Days is a perfect example of what tempo is. You're trading 0 mana to get nab at least 1 extra mana out of them. And a lot of times, especially in the first couple turns, that 1 mana can make or break a line or your position in the game or set you back even a full turn.
Hmm. When I was recording gameplay with Playing with Power, just a week and a, yeah, 2 weeks ago,
Yeah.
we had this interesting situation come up where I dazed Mike's Najila because he accelerated out a ton of mana, some mana dorks, and then finished the turn with a Najila. And I was like, huh, I don't want that Najila to be there because, Najila, a ton of mana. It was a good play on my part to just daze the Najila, set him back in that situation. And then turn passed to me, I developed my land back. I developed a little bit more mana. I passed the turn. It goes over to Zach, and he just untaps, plays a land, casts a Naz. And he still has 1 mana up afterwards. So like he could have paid for the days if I had saved the days for the Naz. But then after he spent like 25 minutes digging through his pile and trying to assemble the win, he needed exactly 1 mana to win the game. So if I had had my days up for that Naz, it would have prevented the win attempt. But like that's something like I wouldn't have known. I don't know what was in the top 30 cards of his deck when he
Yeah, it's
Nazed.
impossible
But
information at that
Yeah,
point.
the difference between resolving an ad nause with 1 extra mana and resolving an ad nause with 0 extra mana makes those lines a little bit tighter.
yeah, but it's like that's just something that I just want to point out is like 1 mana is really important in CDH, and so sometimes just taxing that 1 mana can be super impactful. I mean, we've all played games where there's a Thalia out, right? And Thalia is just days on steroids, so it's really obnoxious. But
Yeah, again, when you're
Yeah, it's
playing around the best 1 and 2 and 0 mana spells in the format, adding 1 mana to them when you're not expecting it is backbreaking.
mm-hmm. Yeah,
cool. I think that's really interesting. Uh, we'll see how that plays out in the next few weeks here. I haven't gotten got by it yet, but I feel like I will at some point. But we'll see.
I have been dazed more times than I care to count. Not in this format yet, but it does not feel
Okay.
good.
Well,
Especially the shame of playing your land after getting dazed. Boy, does that feel
oh
awful.
my
You
god.
you don't play that land. You hold that land. You
You
hold
hold that
that.
land. You just concede and walk away. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, those are misplays that you only get got by it once, right? You're never gonna do it again. But I don't know. I haven't played Legacy, so
No, it'll be me playing around the Mindbreak Trap, Force of Will, and Days.
And then your
yeah.
The
Thassa's
next
Oracle
game I
gets
play, Rob.
stifled. Wait till that comes
Oh,
out.
oh,
Stifled.
I'm Stifled next CDH staple.
I remember when people were hot on Stifle a couple months ago, and God, that went away pretty quick. I
The
mean,
best stifle is the one that you never had.
exactly.
It turns out the best stifle is actually just the Days that counters the Dockside in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, a 3-mana Dockside is like way worse than a 2-mana Dockside.
Well, when I'm
So.
not expecting it, my turn 2 Dockside that I kept on no leftover mana just gets a
Mm-hmm.
little eaten.
Yeah, it gets got.
Or God forbid, like they spent a dark ritual or cracked a jeweled lotus to cast a 5-mana Crom.
Days.
Like
Oh,
those resources are just gone.
it feels so good. Yeah, I was. There's always one game that I'll highlight when talking about Mindbreak Trap. But I played against a guy who was on a Malta like 5 or a Malta 4, and they jammed out Lotus Petal, Lion's Eye Diamond, and like a ritual, I think, to cast their Crom. Or some combination of free mana with no lands. Cast their Crom, it got Mindbreak trapped, and then they had absolutely nothing and no cards in hand. And it was like, yeah, it's an
Yeah, I
absolute
might have
blowout.
done that a couple times to other people and
Yeah,
myself, but it's definitely a blowout. I was
there's no way to recover. So,
Mindbreak Trap was definitely one of those cards that it's not even that old in my deck list, but like after you discover it, it's like why the hell have I not seen this card anywhere ever before?
didn't it come out in like 2012 or something? And
I don't
just
I
no one's been
didn't
playing
even
it in
play I
Commander
haven't even
until
played
like
the
a year
game
and a
like
half
2
ago.
years, all right? So I have no
Yeah,
clue. But flash the good card emote
yeah.
right there.
Impact good card right here.
Impact Bond, good card. Yeah, I wanted to go off on that side tangent because it's been something I wanted to talk about for quite some time.
All right, coming
That's
back to the main topic, I did want to bring up this thing that I've been noticing more and more as a trend. A lot of decks that I wouldn't call as a Stax deck, they were probably like more mid-range or control in nature. They're starting to play more and more Stax pieces. Greg, for instance, in control, you've played Dothy Voidwalker. I would call that a
hmm
Stax piece, wouldn't you?
Yeah, it is a stack space. It prevents win attempts from happening. It has the added benefit of you get to steal their win attempt. So if someone is brave enough to cast an Adnaz while there's a Dothy out, I can be like, ha, count your Adnaz, and then I'll steal that with my Dothy on my turn. Um, doesn't happen often, but having cards that have multiple uses, like if it's a stacks effect that can also grant me some form of advantage down the line, I've probably considered it.
I think the best some of the best decks right now are the decks that can enable multiple strategies. I'm just gonna give Winota as an example here, just before I talk about what I really want to talk about. Winota is kind of like a turbo deck and a stacks deck, so it mixes two archetypes and it puts them together and kind of gets the best of both worlds. But then you look at a control list that runs stacks, like what deck just won the comedian played? Is it Tivit?
Tivit.
Pivot.
Yeah, so Tivit
Pivot.
just won, and I've looked at this deck list, and it's like it doesn't seem like it would be that strong, but it's mixing a lot of counter magic with a lot of stacks pieces. So it's deploying the stacks pieces before there's a counter spell that's able to stop them, and then protecting them on the stack throughout the game to just get a lot of value out of them. So
Mm-hmm.
so they stay around for a long time until it can eventually assemble its win. And I watched the finals of the Mox Masters tournament, and that's 100% what happened. Is there was just a couple stacks pieces that were just protected on the stack for like 4 or 5 turns until Tivit was able to secure a win
Mm-hmm.
through a combo. So I think just meshing the best of both archetypes really helps a deck be really good right now.
I think two prime examples of cards that I see doing this quite frequently: Grafdigger's Cage and Drannith Magistrate. Those cards are just an absolute menace for a lot of decks.
Mhm.
Drannith Magistrate has been pretty obvious. The asymmetrical nature of it as a stacks piece just makes it an
Mhm.
auto include in every white deck. Grafdigger's Cage is something you see less frequently as the premier win con in the format. I would say is Underworld Breach. I know it's really like Thassa's Oracle is the card that says that says win the game, but it's really Breach that is the thing that is enabling these Grixis shells.
Oh,
Mhm.
Breach is
And
just an
Grafdigger's
absolutely
Cage
ridiculous
just
card.
absolutely destroys it. And a lot of these more mid-rangey creature-focused decks, they're all focused on cards like Finale of Devastation, Eldritch Evolution, Neoform. Protean Hulk was through a couple different versions. I think we're in the top 8 or the top 16 of this tournament as well. Grafdigger's
I mean,
Cage shuts all of that down.
didn't Gustav pilot
Timna Halana. It
Abzan
was
Yep.
Helena or Abzan
Yep.
yeah.
Hulk in top 4? So
I
Exactly.
played against that deck a lot, and I wish I had a Grafdigger's Cage during that
yeah,
matchup. But the interesting thing about Grafdigger's Cage is everyone can run it, right? It's a colorless card, but like, why don't we see it more then? Especially if it stops the premier quote unquote win con of CDH right now.
Well, it's a symmetrical stacks piece. Like, if you want to play those premier win cons, why are you shutting yourself off? My strategy is get Underworld Breach in play as fast as possible, or start flipping creatures off the top of my deck with Winota. Grafdigger's Cage on turn 1 is like the opposite of what I want to be doing with those decks. I think
Mhm.
it's more of like, I see it traditionally in a lot of Esper lists. Like, I know Gustav has also been playing a lot of his Malcolm Timna list. I've also picked up a bit trying to learn how to cast the card ad nauseum because I have no idea how to do that. That also, it's a storm deck. It's trying to cast ad nauseum. It's running Grafdigger's Cage because it's not on Breach and it really can house a lot of the Grixis piles.
Yeah, agreed.
Oh, 100%. It's the symmetrical stacks of it that 100% shuts down decks, because I look at it in a lot, like in all the decks I play, I look at it and I'm like, I kind of really want to run this card. But then I look at the 5 or 6 or 7 cards that it shuts off in my own deck and I'm like, no. Because
Yeah.
then you just want to end up removing your own stacks piece, and that's not a great spot to be in deck building stacks.
Yeah, another
Well,
huge example of this in Ian's list actually is Curse Totem. His deck gets to take advantage of the ability to play Curse Totem, which really shines a lot of these mid-range mirrors. Greg, how does Thrasios feel about
I
Curse Totem?
Thrasios does not like Curse Totem at all. Let me tell you, it's a really miserable card to play against because it just prevents everything that the deck like has an option to fall back onto. Which is why recently I was invested so heavily in curiosity effects, and so I'm on Ophidian Eye in my own list right now, and it's like at least I have some form of advantage out of the command zone that isn't shut off instantly by a stacks effect that I know a couple people in my local group have been playing. So
Again,
Yeah,
it is
100%.
a symmetrical stacks piece, and you really have to either find a deck that doesn't care about that, or you have to make some pretty huge costs to play it.
I know that back in the old days of Timnacrom Opus Thief, that deck was playing Curse Totem because Breach wasn't out yet. There a lot of those effects weren't out yet, and so that deck was on all of the cheap artifact hate pieces because it stopped what was dominant at the time, which was Thrasios Timna mid range, and yeah.
This is one of the reasons I just want to point out that I actually think control as an archetype is really interesting because it can adapt to a lot of things. Whereas if I'm playing stacks, I kind of have to mulligan for what I need, and I can't just get that generic counter spell that will counter everything, or the one thing that I don't know is out there but I know will be. So I think that's really interesting.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, you really have to form some form of a game plan of like, I need this type of effect and I need it now. And you will often go down to like 4 or 5 cards just to see that type of effect.
So talking about asymmetrical effects, what do you think about the Karn asymmetrical null rod? Why would that not be played then? Because it's not difficult to cast. I mean, 4 colorless mana is really easy to get to, especially if you're
Let
not
me
shutting off your own
let me
artifacts.
ask you this, Greg. How many 4 drops are in your deck? Curious control. Just off the top of your head. Probably less than 5,
Three,
right?
three.
3. So
One
Yeah,
of
I'm
that's
them's
saying.
what,
3
Mindbreak
slots.
Trap, that's not really a 4 drop.
Oh no, so
Okay.
it's Mindbreak Trap, Deadly Relic, and then Culling Ritual. So
Okay, so we're talking like
it's just Culling Ritual.
So we're
It's
talking,
just
if
Calling
you're gonna
Ritual.
run a spell that's so expensive, it has to really be worth that slot. So the question here is it worth to run a 4-drop that's an asymmetrical null rod um, over just a counter spell at that point, or something else that's cheaper and more
That's
reliably cast.
that's a difficult question because if I'm in dedicated stacks, right, where my deck list when it comes to mana accelerants, it's like Soul Ring, Mox Diamond, Chrome Mox, and
And a
Mana
crypt.
Crypt, right?
Mhm.
The power four of EDH. I probably wouldn't be on Karn because I don't have the fast mana to really support it because I want to be playing these effects on turn one or turn two.
That's
But
definitely the big thing. When
in
I'm looking for a null rod effect in a matchup, I want that as soon as possible, and I'm
yeah,
usually doing so at the expense of shaving a lot of that artifact mana out of my deck to begin with.
but Curious
So
Control sits in
while
this
yeah,
weird spot where it's like I get to use my artifact mana, and if I can use my artifact mana to ramp into a asymmetrical artist like an asymmetrical null rod that also starts killing people's moxins for when the Karn eventually goes away, it still leaves me in a position where I can just do my thing where I just land pass and have all this mana to throw into my Thrasios or to throw into my counter spells. And so it's in a much better spot the slower your deck wants to be. But it's not as proactive as Stax. I'm not mulliganing for the turn one Karn because I'm not normally mulliganing for the turn one Null Rod. And so if I was in a deck where I want to be landing these effects on turn one, I would never consider Karn. If that
it's
makes
I
sense.
think you just
Yeah.
answered your
very
own question right there.
yeah.
Yeah.
You can't proactively play Karn, and in a stack deck, you want to proactively stop your opponents. So therefore, the two don't work together. So like you said, you can play Karn in a deck that can afford to wait to play it, and just get the value later. But if we're talking about a stacks deck that wants to get the effect out now, it can't wait to play Karn, especially since it's probably going to also be on Null Rod and other things, so it already has a shaved mana base,
Mhm.
artifact wise.
Even something like Rule of Law is seeing less and less play because it's 3 mana for a symmetrical stacks piece. It's just too much. It doesn't come down when you need it to come down. You really
Mhm.
need to start impacting the game from the get go. That's why you see cards like Deafening Silence over it, because that even though it doesn't shut down all spells, they can still go Timna plus something. That
Yeah.
that 1 mana piece that you need to interact with the game is exactly what you're looking for. If you're going up
So
to 3 mana, that effect has to be huge. You're looking at something like Archon of Emeria, which is not just a rule of law, it is also hamstringing your opponent's mana base asymmetrically at that.
yeah, I don't know if you guys have ever tried cracking fetch lands into an Archon, but it's not a fun time.
Oh, I'm a root maze player. I love
It
when y'all say
basically
Love
feels like
me,
a
love me
fucking blood
that.
moon. Yeah.
Blood Moon's another effect that I wanted to bring up that has almost disappeared from a lot of the format. You see, like, pretty much just mono red decks like Magda and Godo will still run it, but something like Blood Pod
one word for
as a
you,
fetch.
uh, Dockside. Dockside
Yeah,
completely negates Blood Moon in every way, shape, and form, and it's so easy to find. And I typically deploy my Talisman or whatever out before you're casting this Blood Moon because it's at 3
mhm.
mana, like you said. So I'm able to just kind of find what I need to find before you play your thing that will actually stop me, which is really the downside of 3 mana or greater stacks pieces.
Yeah, Blood Moon in particular, the completion of the Talisman cycle, giving 3 and 4 color decks access to numerous 2 mana rocks, Arcane Signet also being thrown in there, just being able to produce pretty much whatever colors your deck needs outside of the mana base. And just Dockside being an absolute house in this format. It is one of the most degenerate cards in our format.
Agreed.
Um, and
Dockside's
not
messed
only
up.
is it castable under Blood Moon, it is often Blood Moon that is hampering your other players' ability to help counter or prevent that Dockside from coming down. So you're kind of just handing that person the win. I've seen it
Yeah.
quite frequently, and in decks like Metapod, we've pretty much cut Blood Moon as a card.
Yeah, see, this is like a weird Blood Moon debate that I have with people all the time. I would never play Blood Moon because I'm in a 4 color deck. It would just murder me. But I think those effects are still really strong because in my mind, if they have the Dockside under the Blood Moon or without the Blood Moon, right? And they're going to be winning under the Blood Moon or without the Blood Moon with Dockside into whatever. Is the Blood Moon preventing that much? I mean, how many counter spells do you run or that actually stop creatures, right? There's like Force of Will, Mind Break
Mind Break
Trap,
Trap, Pact of Negation,
Pact,
Daze.
Days, technically,
Yeah.
yeah, if you're crazy enough to play Days. But it's basically just like Force of Will, Pact, and Mind Break Trap. There are so few decks that have actually considered being on Mana Drain. I'm on Mana Drain and Counterspell and Drown in the Lock, and like I have more answers for creatures because it's just like what I feel like needs to be targeted. But a lot of decks can't answer a Dockside, and so
But Dockside
if
doesn't actually say win the game on it. There's going to be some follow-up non-creature spell, some instant or sorcery after it, that ad nause. If you
that's
don't
fair,
have access to your blue mana from your lands, because I'm the idiot that played Blood Moon and then someone followed it up with the Dockside, like that feels bad as the Stax player, because like I didn't actually stop the game. I ended the game.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's really contextual, I guess. But it's like most of the time, I don't think it's really the fault of the Blood Moon. It's the fact
Mhm.
that the next guy just happens to have Dockside into Naws or Dockside into whatever payoff spell that they have.
I think Dockside is
But
prevalent enough where people are actively looking to get to it as fast as possible. Like, how many people Vampiric Tutor or gamble on turn one if they already have the mana crypt? They're going for Dockside's the next thing.
yeah,
Evan, that's the
Here's
first thing
the
you're looking to get in Animar, right? Dockside.
every single game I probably cast 3 to 4 Docksides a game on average, just in Animar alone. But the thing that's really important to make about this point though is 3 mana Blood Moon didn't actually stop me from doing anything at that point. I just cast my few copies of Dockside and won the game. But if you paid 3 mana for at least a Rule of Law, that would have completely shut me down. So if Rule of Law is becoming not good enough, how does Blood Moon even compete for that spot anymore? Um, and that's just my thought process, is that Stax really needs to run efficient Stax pieces at sub 3 mana in this format to be prevalent still.
yeah. So as we
Completely
come to
agree.
a close in this podcast, do we have any final thoughts about Control versus Stacks and like what the key differences are? Um,
I'm just going to leave with the hot take that I think that they're still both control decks, and each one is. I know, I know. Each one has its strengths and its pros and cons, but I think they both are just control decks in their own right.
Yeah,
so
Collector
on
Oof
a
and Counterspell are the same card, pretty much. They're both 2 mana, both start with C, both get played in control decks,
Oh,
according
let's
to
not take
Evan.
too
all right,
many hot.
all
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So
That's what I'm saying.
public service announcement: the Past Priority Podcast is now looking for 2 new co-hosts. Please
Oh,
hit me up on
jeez.
Twitter, and we'll get you on here to record as soon as possible.
For other notes, I'm also looking for new podcasts to be a part of and co-host, so hit me up.
Yeah, no, but so and then at the end of all these podcast episodes, I'm gonna try to do a weird community segment where I'll tweet out something before, or in this case, halfway into a recording process, and get a question from the internet. And James at Squirrel Mob MTG, a wonderful fellow. Fuck, I can't speak today. Asked the
Take your
question:
time.
who's your favorite duck? With no context at all.
I like the Ugly Duckling personally.
The Ugly Duckling.
He has a great redemption arc. He really comes back and hits through at the end, using his looks to sway.
I'm a big Daffy Duck guy. That's
I'm going to have to go with the duck in Duck Chess. I'm also a big fan of chess, and they've introduced a new mode called Duck Chess, which is very entertaining to watch, so I'm going to have to go with that guy.
all right. Awesome. And then just wrapping things up, yeah, I'm Greg. This has been the Past Priority Podcast. You can find me at Curious Control on Twitter, at Curious Control on Moxfield, and I hang out on a couple of big Discord servers, and you usually find me talking about Control. I'll have the invite link to the Curio Hub or the Control Hub in the description below.
Yeah, and you can find both Zach and I there as well in the Curio Hub.
I think we're gonna cue outro music. I don't know. The endings of these are fairly casual. I'm not quite sure what I want to do yet, so there'll be
We
exit
passed
music
priority.
playing right now. Yeah, and we passed priority. That's the end of the
Yeah,
podcast.
we passed priority.
We passed.